Alright, let's talk about handing out mess wine during Prohibition, and other good things the Catholic Church did. Cheers! Welcome back everybody to me talking about books, and today we'll be talking about one specific book, and that is Cahokia Jazz by Francis Spufford, which came out last year. And we'll do the usual thing, where I give you a quick synopsis and tell you why you should read the book, which you should, and then I sit back and drink beer while you do that, and then we talk about themes and other stuff that will include spoilers, so you have that warning there. But before we do that, I have to go on a quick rant. Alright, so I listened to the audiobook of Cahokia Jazz, which is really good. You should listen to it if you enjoy that kind of thing. But there's one important issue. The printed version and the ebook do have a historical afterword where Francis Spufford looks at his world building and gives some notes and comments and so forth. The audiobook doesn't. And it doesn't even include quick information that the afterword is not existent. It's also not available as an additional PDF download or anything of the sorts that some books do. And that is a problem. Now, obviously, there's always conversations about whether listening to audiobooks is the same thing as reading, and I usually don't go down that road because, if you want to do that argument, usually you want to do like a pissing contest or dick measuring contest on who reads more and has more books on their Goodreads challenge. And you know what? If that's the thing they want to do, you can do that on your own. I don't have to deal with that. But there are, of course, more academic conversations to be had about that, usually about performance and stuff, and I've talked about that. But there's another thing. If I want to claim that I have read an entire text, then I need to have all the text, and that includes an afterword or a foreword. And in this case, this afterword is like, 5 pages maybe? It's really short. I found out because friends of mine have read, the printed book and the ebook, so I know it exists. That's how I found out. And I didn't get that. So there's no real, reason to not include that. It's not, a map that, is hard to translate into audio. It's not even like a family tree like you may have in Lord of the Rings with the appendices, which is kind of difficult but not impossible to turn into audio. It's also not, a list of vocabulary or whatever of the sorts, which can also be rather boring to do. No, it's just a quick text of 4 pages that you could have just added, but you didn't. And that is fucked up. Seriously. I, as someone who is sort of has to listen to audiobooks or use an ebook and use their screen reader, I am sort of reliant on that kind of stuff. You're leaving that out. And I'm not alone. Yes, I'm blind, but there's other people who also can't read for whatever reason and they will never find out that they're missing some part of the text. That is ableist. That is really bad. And it's so fucking unnecessary. What it basically signals is that publishers don't actually think that audiobooks are the same as books and don't value their listeners the same way they value the people that buy the printed book. And that also is fucked up. So yeah, fuck you for doing that. And just to be clear, this is not the only time this has happened. For example, the Warlord Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell, also the audiobooks don't include the historical afterwards. And if I want to, make a conversation or a video on these kind of books, I kind of feel I have to get some way to also get the full text, which, may include buying an additional ebook or finding other ways to get to that additional text. And that is annoying. So yeah. Just wanted to put that out of the way, get that out of the way before. If you are someone who works in publishing, don't do that shit. If you, have contacts to any publishers, tell them to don't do that shit. And now, let's actually start and talk about the book. Alright, Cahokia Jazz is a alternate history, hard-boiled crime procedural. That's the main thing you need to know. So, if you have read something like The Yiddish Policeman's Union, you kind of know where this is going. If not, let me explain. This is a story set in the 1920s in the city of Cahokia. Now, you may not know the city of Cahokia, because it's been abandoned since the 1400s. It's one of the mound cities near the Mississippi in Illinois, I guess. And, yeah. In this alternate timeline, the city of Cahokia does still exist. It's the 1920s, it's Prohibition, it's jazz time, and the city of Cahokia is a multicultural, multi-ethnic society with Native Americans, Black Americans, and White Americans all living together having sort of the same kind of rights. And we are following 2 detectives. Our main focus character is Joe Barrow, a half-Native, half-Black former World War I veteran who's working for Cahokia PD, and the murder investigations are going on. And he and his partner Finn Drummond are sent to a very grisly murder scene, and they are trying to figure out what's going on there. And if you've ever read any book like that, you know it's not going to stay just one specific murder investigation. There's other stuff happening in the background. Intrigues, drugs, all the stuff, and everyone will be sad and beaten up multiple times by the end of the book. You'll get all of that in a very, very well-written form. So that's the quick synopsis. I will not tell you anything more. Why should you read this? Well, as I said, it's incredibly well done. Francis Spufford does know his history. Francis Spufford does know his genre fiction. Francis Spufford knows how to use words. And those are the best prerequisites to writing a great book. If you enjoy this kind of, hard-boiled noir kind of fiction, you're going to love this because it's just really well written. It's a page-turner. The plot is constantly going on. The world building of this very unique city is definitely woven into the whole thing. You'll have fun, a lot of fun with it. So if you like alternate history, if you like crime fiction, you go and read that book. And that's exactly what you should do right now while I have a bit of a beer, and then we'll talk about the details. All right. I assume you have finished the book by now, so let's talk about it in detail. From here on out, there will be spoilers, so be forewarned, and since this is a crime fiction, at least some of those spoilers might include who's done the killing. Now, anyway, let's get started, and first I want to talk about genre for a quick bit, and then we'll move beyond that. So as I said, this is a combination of different genres. It's alternate history, and it's crime fiction, and it's sort of speculative fiction, which is, where alternate history kind of falls under. So let's look at these three genres and look at how they kind of combine or don't. Alternate history, for the first part. What's alternate history? Well, it's usually fiction that looks at our history and then asks, what if something went differently? Well, those depend on what you're going to do with that. Favorite ones or famous ones are, of course, The Man in the High Castle. What if the Nazis actually won World War II? Other ones are The Yiddish Policeman's Union by Michael Chabon, which is obviously asking the question what if there was a Jewish refugees were settled in Alaska? There are obviously others. Another one that I guess is relatively famous is, of course, the one by Philip Roth about what if Charles Lindbergh became president of the United States. There's more of them. That's the first form of what if kind of fiction in that regard. There's another one that kind of gets dark quickly and is usually beloved by people that really jerk off at the sight of any military equipment and are usually asked questions like, what if Germany won World War I and everything became very Prussian and so forth? We're not going to talk about those. Now, why are these kind of alternate history books interesting, alternate history stories interesting? I think they can be either a utopia or something of that sort. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, they can show, what if something went better in the case of Cahokia Jazz? What if, the smallpox epidemic wasn't as deadly and we didn't genocide all the Native Americans by the beginning of the 20th century, so they have, more power and thus more of a voice in American history. That's, on the first hand, an interesting question. It does create this multicultural society in the 1920s where in America, this didn't exist. So that is, in this regard, a utopia. It's also a utopia in a specific other way, and that is, obviously, it's not exactly Marxist, but it's certainly not a full-on neoliberal capitalist world either, because there is the land trust and the water trust, and the idea of a community holding these resources in common. That's also very utopian, almost Marxist, one might say. That's really the main thing here. But what these utopias do, like all utopias, or dystopias as well in that regard, but is talk about where we are today, what we are living with today. The Yiddish Policeman Union does the same thing, looking at, what if evangelical Christians and Christian Zionists get their way. Spoiler, I guess it's no longer fully what you might call a alternate history, but anyway, so this is where this first part comes in. I would argue that Cahokia Jazz is alternate history utopia, making statements about our world by contrasting it with a much better world that could have been. But the important part is not look at how good it could have been, but more think about what went wrong here and what can we fix about it. That's the important question to be asked here. Now let's move on to the next part, which is, of course, crime fiction. See, I've looked at this before, and I've read some other alternate history books. In fact, I just did that in May when I read Cahokia Jazz first, because I wanted to talk about alternate history in general, and then, I got sidetracked. But one thing that is really interesting is that a lot of alternate history stories are using the mode of the detective story, of the hard-boiled, noir, police procedural, depending on where you are. They are using that specific mode. And the question is, of course, why? I want to point that out quickly before we move on. The detective story, the investigator story, has one big advantage for this kind of speculative fiction. It allows us to go with a focus character, a main character, through that city and ask questions. Now, obviously, info dumps are not something that people like, but an investigator can go into places and ask stupid questions. That's kind of his job, right? And that is one of the big advantages of the detective fiction when it comes to presenting different scenes, different places, different settings in a lot of ways. That's one part here. And I think we see that very specifically with Joe Barrow in Cahokia Jazz, what with him not being part of the city, coming from somewhere else, but also standing apart as being, well, half native and half black, and thus never fully sure where he stands and who he is and so forth, which allows him to ask a lot of questions that would otherwise feel forced in a lot of ways, so that's good. The second part, and I think this is also really important, is that the genre of the hard-boiled, of the noir, is very, very clearly delineated and has probably had one of the deepest impacts on modern pop culture in a lot of ways. We all know how that story works. We all know the kind of tropes you have in there. We all know the kind of prose style you have, heavy on metaphors and stuff like that. We all know all of that. And this, I think, is important because it allows the author, in this case Francis Spufford, to portray the city in a more interesting way, because we as readers can sort of lie back a bit and just follow along, because we kind of know where this is going, right? We kind of know how these stories work. At some point, our detective will find a femme fatale, or at some point he'll get beat up, and so we kind of know where this is going, which allows us to look more at the larger themes around that and behind that in a lot of ways. And that, I think, is important. The next important part about why crime fiction, next to horror fiction, is probably one of the most political genres in fiction in general, because it looks at all the things that are currently wrong in our world, and especially the hard-boiled or noir usually starts with a simple job, a simple missing person case or whatever, and by the end of the story we usually have figured out how corrupt the entire world is, and our main character is either suicidal or at least has given up life except for constant alcoholism and so forth. But we have had a look at a lot of political and social problems surrounding that. That's kind of what crime fiction can do, in the same way that horror fiction can look at the fears of a specific place and time. And this is important because, once again, as I said, this is a story about a world that is unlike ours, to tell us what is wrong with our world. And in this regard, the political dimension of a crime fiction, of a hardboiled in this case, does also add to it. So that's the second part. Now let's look at the third part of this being speculative fiction and somewhat metafictional in a lot of ways. Alternate history is seen as a form of speculative fiction, of science fiction in a lot of ways, because it's, not our world that we're in, so it's somewhat the fantastic. One thing that I've always talked about is, of course, that the fantastic, like any form of literature, any school of literature, is very much a conversation with other artists, writers, and so forth in the same field. And this is where the metafiction comes in. If you combine crime fiction, genre crime fiction, with alternate history and other elements of that, what you do, in a postmodern age, of course, is you cite heavily, you reference all kinds of other books in all kinds of ways. Now, as I said, for example, the Yiddish Policemen's Union certainly is something that is hovering in the background of this specific book. Just by the way the setup has been done, I would argue that is the case. On the other hand, you also have other elements, quotations from other books, both crime fiction and so forth. We can just wholesale make references, use titles, quotes, and so forth to defamiliarize or familiarize the author, the reader, with this place, and allow them to sort of draw in their experience with these books and works that are cited, once again to like open up the context and add context without, adding another 200 pages just by referencing something. There's one scene in particular that I think is relevant here, and that is, of course, a very clear citation, reference, whatever you want to call it, or homage to The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which is in the slaughterhouse scene with Louis Bessa in this specific place. And this, once again, ties into the whole idea of this being a utopia, very much about, anti-capitalism in a lot of ways, and we'll come to that in a moment. So these are the three sort of genre elements that I wanted to talk about. Now let's look at the two main issues here, and that being the personal change, growth, or whatever you want to call it, the personal journey of Joe Barrow on the one hand, and then the larger setting on the other hand, and then we'll hopefully end this with 2 or 3 questions that I feel I have to ask. All right, Joe Barrow's personal journey. What with, crime fiction in general and the hardboiled in general is usually very much about the character of the detective, in this case, obviously a police detective, but it doesn't really matter. Who has to question his ideas, his character in a lot of ways, and oftentimes loses his way and becomes very much a moral relativist and cynic in a lot of ways because the world around him is getting ever more complicated and brutal. This book is sort of similar, but it does not necessarily always work out, and I think that's maybe because it's shorter, or maybe because it's putting too much focus on the larger themes around it. But Joe Barrow's journey is definitely, once again, follows that specific role. It just doesn't fully resolve itself, I would argue. And the story is, of course, Joe being very much someone who is comfortable in not finding a place. He's hovering between different roles. And the question is, like, can he actually find his role and decide who he wants to be or who others want to be? And he's constantly hovering between that. He's a cop. He's an ex-veteran. I mean, he's a veteran of World War I. He's also a musician, a jazz musician, and jazz is definitely playing a huge role in this book, right? And throughout the story, we start him becoming more self-aware, not constantly following what Finn Drummond tells him to do, slowly falling first into, the orbit of the Hashi family, in this case, obviously mostly the princess, the woman of the moon, but in general falling into their orbit, starting to do what these people expect him to do when he becomes or takes on the role of thrown away brother. And then finally making up his mind, hopefully, and deciding to become a musician. But once again, this is also a role that others have for him in store. He's very good at music, and we get the idea that that's actually what who he really wants to be, with him constantly, playing or working out songs, even when he's not actually sitting at a piano. So this seems to be the role that he wants to take on. Even though, once again, it's Dolphus and his musician friends who basically force him to come with them. And he makes that decision. Hopefully it will be his final decision. Obviously, that's not how the book ends, with, him up on that roof in probably one of the most die-hard moments I've read in a long time. But this is sort of like the journey that he's on, from someone who is hovering between all these different roles and just not questioning what he actually wants to do, and just moving along because that allows him to not think about it, to someone who is forced to confront these questions and decide who he wants to be, if he wants to take on a role, feel community, and responsibility, or if he wants to sort of forge his own path, which is what joining that band would possibly or probably be. I think it mostly works when we're talking about his conversations and so forth with Drummond, not so much, I guess, with the Hashi family, although it's interesting to see how both these groups, and Dolphus to a certain point as well, although Dolphus at least asks, the other two just assume, the other two groups, those being Finn Drummond and of course the Hashi family, they just assume he will do what they tell him to do. And that's important here. Finn Drummond, on the one hand, I would argue does that because he is, he's white, and there is a certain form of white privilege. Yes, he says that he doesn't see color, and that's sort of why Joe kind of follows him at the beginning when they meet in that specific hospital, a scene that really reminds me of All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, which also a book you should probably read. That's why he probably assumes that Joe will just do what he's told. On the other hand, we have a more like elite assumption. So we have like the race assumption by Finn Phineas Drummond, and on the other hand we have the Hashi family, who by virtue of being, well, if not official monarchy anymore, are still basically the people that rule the city and own the city. And the upper classes, always capitalists and so forth, always assume that people that are underneath them do what they are told, and will just, they don't even have to be told. They are human resources, basically. So we have those two ways of sort of looking at this. There is obviously another dimension in that love story between, people who are taking on these roles in the elite are also very much forced to conform to specific rules and are not exactly capable of living the way they want to live, because there are sort of, capital does use the people in charge just as much as it uses the people that are not in charge. But mostly I think the idea is between different people assuming who you want to be and making that choice when you are actually asked, and getting the chance to say no if you want to. And that, I think, is the personal journey that we can see with Joe Barrow, maybe better or maybe worse. I would argue it does kind of fall behind the more thematic exploration of the setting and so forth. So let's look at that. It's a book that is not exactly happy with capitalism. Now, I think what is important here is the time and period it is set in. This is 1920s America, which is one of those periods that you may not have learned enough about in history class, because it's one of the key turning points in, modern history in a lot of ways. It is the time after World War I, with the Soviet Republic being... the Soviet Union becoming more and more powerful, the Civil War there ending, there are still very powerful labor movements, unions and so forth in the United States as well, and the fight of capital trying to subdue these labor movements. That war is incredibly brutal and dark, and you just look at, the time that Americans actually bombed workers in America who were on strike. For example, just look at the way veterans were treated after World War I, all the way to the attacks and destruction of the bonus army in the 1930s. So this is sort of the context for this setting. And what Francis Spufford does by setting it in a city that does work differently, where property and land is held by the actual community and rented out or lent to people for a specific time and so forth, and not actually bought, by having a multi-ethnic, multicultural society in there is, a very different, a very contrasting way of setting up a society. And that allows Spufford to look at how in our world, those labor conflicts were actually dealt with. And that is, of course, through racist violence, because one of the things that always happened in these times was to pit black and white Americans against each other, and thus, take rights away from all laborers and all workers at the same time. Obviously, in the 1920s, in our timeline, there were not necessarily enough Native Americans left to consider them like a separate block, but that's just our world. So the plot of this novel that we kind of discover over time, with Vanderburg and other capitalists plotting to create a situation that allows them to bring in external forces to break up this very specific model of society and turn it into the classic capitalist model of society, neoliberal capitalist society that is forged and built on land ownership, and from there on the opportunity to take away and all the rights from laborers and exploit them as much as possible. Once again, it has obviously connections to our world, and Spufford even mentions them with, for example, Hawaii as one of the examples on how the United States have done this before. Also, the idea of having rich business people, capitalists, individuals plotting together to overthrow a form of government. It's not exactly as unlikely as you might think. You can look up the business plot if you feel like it, which is when a bunch of very rich people who are still very rich at this point decided to maybe overthrow FDR and turn America much further to the right, if you want to look at that. So anyway, so there are, once again, historical precedents for this, and this is where I think this world works most strongly, and this is, I think, where Francis Spufford wants to go with this, as I said, anti-capitalist, almost Marxist utopia. It's like, well, this is what happened, what we could have had in all kinds of ways, and we should probably look at what we got instead and how to maybe avoid making it worse or going back from that. And I think having that question of choice, having the idea of personal choice, which is what Joe Barrow's journey is about, extending that all the way to like societies and making it about choice, deciding what to do and not being forced or not being told or assumed by the powers that be. That is very much the idea that is underlying that specific Cahokia society. And I think that all mostly works fairly well. And I think in that regard, it is a very good book. It's an excellent book in that regard. It matches those two things mostly well. It gives us something to think about. It is anti-capitalist, all things that I enjoy. But now we have to talk about the 2 or 3 things that I find somewhat troubling, or which are somewhat open questions. First of all, obviously, these kind of books are morally grey. We all know that, even though I don't like the phrase. But there's something going on here. Because at the end of the day, the conflict on the city or state level is between Vandenberg and his brutal capitalists on the one hand, and the Hashi family, which are also capitalists. Let's not forget that, on the other hand. So even though there might be slightly more choice with the Hashi winning this round of the conflict, it is still very much based on the idea that everyone in Cahokia has to trust the ruling family to actually make the right choice. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, I mean, they're native, they're not white, and if we assume that all of the rest of the United States is mostly fairly racist, and yeah, I guess they can be seen as definitely a better version than just like a racist city in that regard, but it is still based on the idea that the rulers of the city are actually the good guys. They are the good rulers, the good kings, so to speak. And that does not necessarily jive well with the underlying ideas about stuff held, community property, and so forth. And that's the first thing. Now, I have an idea on why this may be, and for that we need to move forward to the next sort of problematic aspect, and that is the Catholic Church. See, obviously in this timeline, the Catholic Church, in specific the Society of Jesus, commonly known as Jesuits, have helped the natives in this area to, well, consolidate their power and have sort of like supported now still a key part of Cahokia society. It's a very Catholic society. And this is very interesting and makes for good reading, but there are certain questions that we need to ask. On the one hand, yes, Jesuits were very much not always on the side of just let's kill all the natives. In fact, one of the key early texts describing and accusing Spanish conquerors of mistreating natives was written by a Jesuit. And there are certainly Jesuit groups that have helped individual native groups to, at least for a time, keep some level of sovereignty. So that part works well. Tying this into, the acceptance of Catholic Irish people, who also were obviously disregarded for a long time in the United States, also works well. If you look at parts of the United States being very much Protestant in different forms and having a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment, marrying this sort of the Catholics as, in an American context, also a somewhat of a minority to the native power in Cahokia makes structurally sense. There is, of course, a lot to be talked about why this is maybe not always the best thing to do, what with, the Catholic Church kind of sucking. And one interesting thing here is, of course, that in the background there is the election of the Pope, and the new Pope is named Pius. Now, if you know the name of the Pope during, say, the Holocaust in the 1930s, yeah, that was Pius, and he wasn't exactly, the biggest opponent of the Nazis either. I mean, he did not actively interfere in any meaningful way, so there is some troubling stuff here. Obviously, comparing it to the highly Protestant, often German-style Lutheran and otherwise Protestant anti-Catholic Ku Klux Klan, KKK, in this version of the book makes a lot of sense. The 1920s Klan was, well, on the one hand, basically a MLM to sell lots of fancy robes, and Spufford does make a note of that as well, but it was also very much anti-Catholic and anti-black and anti-Marxist and anti-left, and was thus often supported by big capital. So having this plot point in here is very much historical in a lot of ways, but it does make up a Catholic good, Protestant bad sort of division that I don't think actually works well. Now, here's my theory on why this may be, and for that I have to drop Tolkien. See, Francis Spufford is also very much engaged in Christian apologia sometimes, and if we look at another author who was actually Catholic, I don't know if Spufford is Catholic or Anglican, but those two are not necessarily too far apart anyway. If we look at another person like that, J.R. Tolkien was very much Catholic, and his Catholic beliefs did very much seep into Lord of the Rings and his Middle-earth work. And one thing that Tolkien was very much on board with was good kings who do good rulership in that classic sense. Aragorn being one of the examples, Theoden being a different one. So having the idea of the good rulers, in this case the Hashi family, I feel might sort of jive with that level of defense or apologia for the Catholic Church, who is very much benevolent, except for that one external white priest who gets sent back again. But mostly they're good, right? They give all of their wine to the people drinking under prohibition. They're benevolent. They have allowed different elements of local folk belief to seep in their specific practice, which makes sense. Once again, that's one of the strengths of Catholic belief, that it was always very easy to incorporate local things. Them helping natives, very much an idea that works. The Catholic Church, at least in part, in South America, being sort of not necessarily the most capitalist thing, also has a historic background, right? Freedom theology, very much a thing out there that was almost Marxist. So having these elements in here, I think, works, but it does leave the questions like, should we also mention that there is some structural issues going on with the Catholic Church? But maybe the book is just too short to have all of that. Which leaves us with the final question, and then I'll let you go. Should he have written this book? Francis Spufford is white and British and English in this case, obviously. And this is a book that is set in a world where there are a lot of Native Americans who are actually in power. It uses a lot of different elements of Native culture. Is this something a white Brit should have written? Is a really important question. I have no answer for that. I would argue Spufford does his best by not choosing one specific native culture and appropriating it, but turning Cahokia into a very specific melting pot of all kinds of native cultures. He kind of avoids that specific accusation, but it's still the question of whether someone like Francis Spufford should write a book with this focus in this regard. I personally have no idea. I wish there were, native book reviewers, critics out there who have written about it. I've done a quick search. I haven't found anything so far. If you have found anything, if you are actually, have native background, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And this is kind of where we end. I enjoyed this book. I think it's incredibly well written. It does most things incredibly well. There are just these sort of like kind of important questions left at the end that do not necessarily detract from enjoyment of the book. Once again, this is one of the best written books I've read in a long time. But they kind of leave me wondering, and that's where I want to end this. Let me know what you thought about the book. Have you read it? What do you think about it? Did you enjoy it? There's comment fields out down there. Write me something in the comments. Even if you haven't read the book, tell me something in the comments. I would appreciate it. Also, I don't know, like, subscribe, join the Patreon if you feel like it. And I'll be talking about something else very soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.